The boarding house at 19 High Street was unusually quiet that morning in 1901. Curtains drawn, the air smelled faintly of ether and stale tea. A nurse sat beside a bed, her cap tilted slightly off-center, her hands folded neatly on her lap. The woman in the bed, a matronly tenant in her 60s, breathed shallowly, each exhale a tiny tremor in the stillness. Outside, horse hooves passed in rhythm, distant, detached, like time itself was ignoring what was happening inside this room. The nurse leaned forward, whispering something no one else could hear. Later, a neighbor would say she saw her smiling, softly, like a mother at a cradle. The patient never woke again. Her name would be written in the corner of a coroner's log, marked as cardiac arrest. Nothing unusual, nothing suspect. But the nurse, the one who smoothed her sheets and lingered long after the breathing stopped, would one day confess that this was the moment she realized something divine about death, that she could feel its pulse as clearly as life itself. Her name was Jane Toppan, though few knew her past that year. Fewer still could imagine that the gentle woman tending to Boston's sick and dying had already killed dozens, not in rage, not for money, but for company. She called it experimenting. Others would later call it evil. But in this room, in the hush of that early morning, evil had manners. It brewed tea. It fluffed pillows. It promised comfort right up until the breath left the body. What lingered afterward, between the ticking of the clock and the whisper of her apron, was not guilt, but fascination, the kind that only grows when no one is watching. Detective John Rogers would later admit that he didn't expect her to open the door. "Most suspects run," he'd tell the press. "She straightened my collar." When he arrived at the quiet boarding house on Massachusetts Avenue, Jane Toppan was preparing breakfast. Eggs cooling on a plate, kettle still humming. She didn't ask why he was there, she already knew. The city had grown uneasy, the Davis family had fallen ill in her care, one by one, and whispers had begun curling through hospital corridors like smoke. Yet when Rogers produced the warrant, she didn't flinch. "You've been expecting me, Miss Toppan?" he asked. "Oh yes," she said, smiling faintly. "I wondered how long it would take." She took her coat, adjusted her cuffs, and requested that her patient be given her tea at 11. There was no struggle, no plea, no denial, only a peculiar relief, as if the burden of secrecy had grown heavy. Reporters later described her demeanor as cheerful. The Boston Globe called her the nurse with the laughing eyes. But the laughter, Rogers noticed, never reached her mouth. When they reached the station, she asked whether she could sit by a window. He obliged. She watched the street pass, wagons rolling, pedestrians unaware that one of the most prolific killers in American history sat inches away, humming under her breath. On her lap, she kept her gloves folded perfectly, fingertips aligned. "I never meant harm," she murmured. "They liked me, you know. They always liked me." That single line would haunt Rogers for the rest of his life. Because beneath her calm, he saw not madness, but satisfaction, the kind that comes only when someone believes they've given a gift. He later wrote in his notes, "She looked relieved, like a woman finally seen for what she is." Before the newspapers crowned her America's deadliest nurse, Jane Toppan was known simply as Jolly Jane. The name began as a joke among colleagues at Cambridge Hospital. She was the nurse who brightened the ward, who told jokes while changing bandages, who sang lullabies to the feverish and made the dying laugh. Patients adored her. Physicians trusted her. To the staff, she was warmth incarnate, a woman who could turn the stench of sickness into something almost bearable. But behind that easy laughter was a woman meticulously studying every gesture, every sigh of pain, every flicker of trust. Jane didn't just care for her patients. She observed them the way a scientist might watch a candle burn, timing how long until the flame bends and breaks. "She was the kindest person I ever met," one nurse would later say, trembling through testimony. "Until you looked into her eyes. Then she wasn't there." She wore her cheerfulness like a veil, one she could lift and drop at will. She was playful, but her humor had edges,
testing how much discomfort a person could tolerate before fear showed. Doctors joked that she was addicted to bedside duty, always volunteering for night shifts, always asking for morphine draws. The truth, she was addicted to the nearness of death, the intimacy of it, the way a dying person's breath synchronized with her own. Jane once told a patient, "You're safe with me," and perhaps she meant it. In her mind, she was providing comfort, the ultimate kind. By the turn of the century, her name carried a peculiar reverence, a trust that made her untouchable. Yet in every hospital where she worked, the same pattern whispered through the wards. Patients who improved under others declined under her. And always, she smiled.
When Jane Toppan first arrived at Cambridge Hospital in 1885, she was not yet the spectre she would become. She was 31, older than most trainees, eager, obedient, and always watching. Her file described her as of fine character, cheerful disposition, eager to please. The matron liked her immediately. Jane's hands were steady, her handwriting precise, her smile constant. In those days, hospitals were crowded warrens of human suffering, patients stacked in narrow wards, the air thick with disinfectant and desperation. Death was common, unremarkable. Jane seemed immune to it. She handled bodies the way others handled linens, calmly, efficiently, without hesitation. It impressed her superiors. They gave her more responsibility, more freedom with the medicine cabinet. And it was there, among the glass bottles and tinctures, that something inside her began to shift. Morphine, atropine, digitalis. Each label represented a kind of authority, a power she had never known as a servant or foster child. With each dose she prepared, she controlled the boundary between agony and relief. That line became her obsession. At night, she would linger by her patients' beds, fingers on their pulse, counting heartbeats the way others count prayers. She learned how a body resists and then submits. When a patient slipped away, she didn't recoil. She studied the process. Nurses whispered that she had a strange fascination with the dying. But fascination was the wrong word. It was reverence. She began keeping small notes, how long it took, what color the skin turned, what the patient said last. She wasn't learning medicine anymore. She was learning mortality. And Cambridge Hospital, proud of its promising nurse, had no idea it had just taught her how to kill beautifully.
By 1887, Jane's bedside charm had evolved into something methodical. The morphine bottle was no longer medicine, it was an instrument, and she the conductor. Late into the night, after the matron retired and the halls fell silent, Jane would make her rounds with a quiet authority that few questioned. Her patients adored her, which gave her freedom. She stayed longer than any nurse I'd known, one survivor would recall years later. She'd sit and hold your wrist and hum until you drifted. It was that humming, low, even, almost maternal, that marked the beginning of her experiments. She started with adjustments, as she called them, slight increases to sedatives, minor reductions to stimulants. She wanted to see what death looked like up close, how long it hesitated, how it sounded, how it could be delayed or summoned at will. She'd administer morphine, watch the breathing slow, then revive the patient with atropine, a drug that quickens the heart. In those hours between control and chaos, Jane said she felt closest to God. She claimed she could sense the soul flickering in and out, like a candle flame cupped by her hands. No one suspected her. A few patients even recovered, proof, it seemed, of her talent. But others lingered too long on the edge, gasping, trembling, whispering her name as if in gratitude. "I felt her hand on my chest," one man said before dying. "She told me not to fight." That phrase would appear again and again in her later confessions. Not to fight. Jane didn't kill for anger, nor mercy, she killed for communion, to witness the mystery of life receding. Each experiment brought her closer to a terrible enlightenment, that death could be crafted. And for the first time in her life, Jane Toppan felt powerful. Her name was Amelia Finney, a factory worker admitted to Cambridge Hospital for a mild surgical recovery in 1889. By all accounts, She was expected to heal within a week. The nurses liked her. Jane liked her more. Amelia was young, unmarried, talkative, and easily comforted. She trusted Jane instantly. On her third night, she began to complain of mild pain and restlessness. Jane offered to stay by her bed, murmuring that she would fix it. A small dose of morphine, she said, just enough to help her sleep. Amelia thanked her. The needle slid in smoothly. Moments later, the world began to blur. She remembered Jane's face leaning close, smiling with a tenderness that felt almost holy. "You're safe now," Jane whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. But safety never came. The air thickened in Amelia's lungs. She tried to speak, to call for help, but her body refused. And through the haze, she felt Jane's fingers on her wrist, feeling for the pulse that was fading under her skin. "It's all right," Jane cooed. "Don't be afraid." The morphine should have silenced her heart completely, but Jane wasn't finished. She administered a countermeasure, atropine, jolting the body awake just enough to witness its own collapse. Amelia's vision filled with spots of white light, her throat constricted, she lost consciousness. Hours later, she woke, alive. Jane was beside her, smiling, offering water. "You had a little spell," she said gently. Amelia later told her husband that she'd seen death itself sitting beside me, smiling like a nurse. She never learned how close she came to being Jane's first confirmed success. The hospital recorded her recovery as remarkable. Jane recorded it differently, in a small leather notebook, under one word, almost.
The discovery of Jane's hidden notebook would come years later, long after the headlines had named her a monster. But its origins traced back to those nights at Cambridge Hospital, when she began chronicling her private studies. It wasn't a diary in the sentimental sense. There were no emotions, no confessions, only data, precise notations written in an elegant, almost schoolteacher's hand. Each entry listed a name, a dosage, and a sequence of physical observations. Pulse weakened after 8 minutes, eyes dilated at 12, ceased breathing at 17. At the margin, she'd add small remarks, quiet passing, spoke kindly before sleep. Perfect mixture. The journal wasn't hidden with shame, but stored methodically in her trunk, as if part of her professional equipment. To her, it was research, an anatomy of intimacy. In later interrogations, she said she wrote not to boast, but to remember. "They were mine for those moments," she explained. Each one deserved to be recorded. Detectives would turn the pages like reading a surgeon's log, but there was no surgery here, only orchestration. Dozens of victims chronicled with the precision of a scientist and the detachment of a guard. What unsettled investigators most wasn't the content, it was the handwriting. It never wavered. Not even beside the names of women she'd lived with for years. Among the entries was Amelia Finney, annotated with a quiet satisfaction, responded beautifully. When Detective Rogers later held the book in his hands, he said it felt cold, heavier than paper should. He knew then that this wasn't a collection of murders. It was a record of communion, of a woman who believed she'd transcended morality. Jane once told a nurse trainee, "Doctors heal the body. I perfect the ending." The death diary was her scripture, and she its faithful scribe.
When Jane left Cambridge Hospital in the early 1890s, her reputation was spotless. She had glowing recommendations, a waiting list of families eager to have her nurse or lodge with them. She stepped easily between roles: caregiver, friend, tenant, savior. By day she administered medicine with reassuring precision. By night she shared tea, gossip, and laughter with those who would soon become her victims. Landladies adored her. She paid rent early, helped with chores, even soothed crying infants in neighboring rooms. To every household she entered, Jane brought warmth, an intoxicating calm that made people let down their guard. But beneath that domestic charm was the same hunger that had consumed her at Cambridge. She no longer needed hospital wards to conduct her studies. Boarding houses offered privacy, families offered trust, and sickness offered opportunity. Whenever a new friend complained of stomach pain or sleeplessness, Jane was ready with a remedy. A few drops here, a pinch there, always accompanied by her soft voice. This will make you rest easy. Her victims often died peacefully, surrounded by her care, and Jane would weep convincingly at their funerals. She told one grieving husband, "She went without suffering. That's all we can ask." But witnesses began to notice a pattern. Wherever Jane lived, people fell ill. Neighbors whispered that she carried bad luck. She smiled at the rumors. She enjoyed them. When one landlord joked that she was a curse in an apron, she laughed until tears filled her eyes. "Maybe I am," she said. In reality, Jane had found a rhythm, a cycle of companionship and control. Each home became a stage, each tenant an unwitting participant in her pursuit of closeness. She didn't merely kill to watch them die. She killed to never be alone. In the spring of 1899, Jane moved into the home of her longtime friend, Myra Davis, in Catawmet, Massachusetts. The Davis family welcomed her like kin. Myra's elderly father, Captain Alden Davis, was a retired seafarer, frail but kind. His wife, Mary, enjoyed Jane's company, calling her a blessing in the house. Myra, ever trusting, gave Jane free access to the kitchen and medicine cabinet. Jane called it coming home. Within weeks, she had woven herself into their rhythms: morning coffee, evening walks, quiet talks by the parlor fire. She made herself indispensable. Then came the illnesses. First, Myra herself complained of nausea and weakness. Jane offered to nurse her privately. Within days, Myra was dead, diagnosed with a sudden heart failure. Jane stayed on to comfort the family. A week later, Mrs. Davis began to suffer similar symptoms. Jane remained attentive, spooning her broth, adjusting her pillows, humming softly through the night. Mary Davis died before sunrise. The captain, grief-stricken and dependent, clung to Jane's care. 2 days later, he joined his wife. The Davis household had gone from laughter to funerals in under a fortnight. The local doctor found nothing suspicious. Each death seemed natural, too gentle, too timed. Jane played the part of bereaved friend with immaculate grace, writing letters of condolence to distant relatives. When the Davis niece, Minnie Gibbs, arrived to settle the estate, Jane greeted her warmly, offering to stay a few days to help. She stayed for weeks. Neighbors began whispering again, but who would suspect a nurse who wept so convincingly? Jane later told investigators she wanted to see how it felt to take a whole family. "It wasn't malice, it was curiosity," she said. But behind that curiosity lay something far darker, the satisfaction of being the last person each of them ever saw.
By the time autumn settled over Massachusetts in 1899, whispers of coincidence began knitting themselves into patterns. The Cambridge hospital deaths, the boarding house illnesses, the Davis family tragedy, all bound by one constant name, Jane Toppan. Detective John Rogers, then newly assigned to assist in the growing inquiry, spent weeks tracing her movements. The records didn't align perfectly, but the timeline bled too smoothly to ignore. Wherever she worked or lived, mortality followed, neat and polite. He found hospital ledgers with missing morphine tallies, death certificates signed without autopsies, and a trail of polite thank-you notes written in Jane's flawless cursive to families of the deceased. Each expressed grief, humility, and a strange pride. She went peacefully, just as she wished. Rogers pinned maps to his wall, marking her known addresses with red ink. When he stepped back, it looked like a slow-moving epidemic, one woman drifting from town to town, carrying a disease no medical journal could classify. Yet still, no evidence. Every dose was within therapeutic limits. Every death medically plausible. Even doctors who'd trained her defended her skill. "She was our best," one said. "We trusted her implicitly, and that was precisely how she survived. Trust was her camouflage. She moved through the system with such gentility that no one dared to accuse her of cruelty. A woman in white was supposed to heal, not harm. But Rogers couldn't shake his suspicion. He interviewed former patients who'd survived her care. Their recollections trembled with unease. "She looked too calm," one said. Another recalled waking to her whispering, "You'll be all right soon." Each phrase, repeated across testimonies, carried a quiet finality. Piece by piece, Rogers began to see the truth. Jane's murders weren't random. They were ritual, a sequence of intimacy, control, and surrender replayed until perfect.
When questioned years later about her motive, Jane Toppan didn't speak of greed or revenge. She didn't weep or plead insanity. She simply tilted her head, as if puzzled by the question. "I didn't kill for hatred," she said softly. "I killed because I wanted to hold their souls for a moment." The statement chilled the courtroom, though few understood what she truly meant. Jane's murders were not about ending life, they were about mastering the instant between living and leaving. She spoke of it as if it were music, describing how a pulse would weaken like the slowing rhythm of a lullaby, how the pupils would widen like twilight settling over a field. "In that second," she told detectives, "I could feel everything they were." Her fascination wasn't with corpses, it was with consciousness itself, the fading of the self into stillness. Each victim, to her, offered revelation. Investigators later noted how she described death in tactile terms: its texture, its temperature, its timing. "She spoke," Rogers wrote, "as if she were explaining a dance, not a crime." When asked if she ever regretted what she did, Jane's smile turned faint. "They were never alone," she said. "I stayed with them. I made sure of that." To her, this was mercy, twisted mercy, but mercy nonetheless. Psychiatrists struggled to categorize her mind. Some called her narcissistic, others sadistic. But one observer, Dr. Edward Cahill, wrote a line that would later define her legacy: "Jane Toppan sought not to destroy life, but to possess it utterly." She turned care into captivity, affection into anesthesia. In her worldview, companionship could outlast breath. And once she discovered that, once she learned that death could bind her to another person forever, she never let go. Before she was Jane Toppan, she was Honora Kelly, a child of no consequence, born in Boston in 1854 to a broken lineage and a name that carried little weight. Her father, Peter Kelly, was an Irish immigrant and a tailor by trade, known around town as Kelly the Crack, a man undone by drink and madness. After his wife's death, his grip on reality slipped entirely. One winter morning, neighbors found him wandering the street, muttering hymns, his hands soaked in his own blood. The rumors said he tried to stitch his eyelids shut to keep from seeing visions. The courts intervened, and Honora and her sister Delia were sent to the Boston Female Asylum, an institution that prided itself on rescuing fallen or neglected girls. It was not rescue. It was rebranding. Children entered as orphans and left as servants, renamed and reassigned to respectable Protestant families. At the asylum, Honora learned silence. Crying was forbidden, affection rationed. Each child was a number, a future made in training. When the Toppan family selected her at age 8, she was rechristened Jane. The name was meant to erase the Irishness, the poverty, the shame. Her new foster mother treated her decently enough, but she was never truly family, more an ornament of charity. She grew up watching the Toppan daughters attend dances, wear silk gloves, and speak French. Jane, meanwhile, polished silver and scrubbed steps. Yet in those long, obedient years, something internalized, a fascination with the structures of gentility, the small performances that made cruelty seem kind. She learned that smiles could hide contempt, that tone could soften domination. Every human interaction became a lesson in control. By the time she left the Toppan household, she had mastered the art of pretending warmth while hiding a void. The orphan had learned that love, like morphine, was something one could administer and withdraw at will.
4 years, Jane Toppan's quiet servitude had sustained her illusion of belonging. She believed herself indispensable to the household that had remade her name. But affection in the Toppan home was conditional, and she was reminded of that one spring afternoon when her foster sister, Elizabeth, announced her engagement. Jane had imagined herself a permanent part of the family's inner circle, a sister in name and sentiment. Yet when the wedding invitations went out, Hers was conspicuously absent. The message was unspoken but devastating. She was the help, not the kin. That omission would become the pivot on which her mind turned. Witnesses later described how, after the marriage, Jane's demeanor changed, her laughter too bright, her kindness too rehearsed. She began visiting Elizabeth and her husband frequently, bringing gifts and offering unsolicited nursing advice. On the surface, she was the same cheerful, jolly Jane. Beneath, something had soured. Years of repressed envy, humiliation, and loneliness fermented into obsession. Elizabeth's new life, her husband, her home, her acceptance, was everything Jane had been denied. And when Elizabeth fell ill in 1899, Jane was ready to reclaim what she believed had been stolen from her. She insisted on tending to her personally, convincing the family doctor that her experience as a nurse made her the best choice. Elizabeth's condition worsened mysteriously under Jane's care. One morning, Jane administered what she called a little something to calm her nerves. Within hours, Elizabeth Toppan was dead. The official cause: exhaustion. But Jane later confessed that this death, above all others, brought her peace. "I held her," she said. "I felt her go, and she was mine again." It was the first killing she described not as curiosity, but as justice. From that moment forward, every act of mercy she performed carried a note of vengeance.
After Elizabeth's death, Jane's transformation was complete. Whatever boundaries once tethered her to conscience dissolved entirely. She had discovered her truest form of control, measured not in obedience or social standing, but in chemistry. Poison was the great equalizer. In a world that had always kept her beneath others, it placed life itself in her hands. She spoke of morphine and atropine the way an artist speaks of color, describing how one softened, how the other quickened, and how their union produced the perfect quieting of the body. To most, these were medicines. To Jane, they were instruments of intimacy. "It made them talk," she explained later. "They told me things no one ever hears, the kind of things that come only when people know they're about to leave." She would sit beside her victims, pulse between her fingers, recording their final words with the precision of a scientist and the tenderness of a lover. It was not rage but ritual. Morphine first, serenity, surrender, eyelids fluttering. Then atropine, a cruel awakening, a flash of panic, eyes wide in confusion. Jane would watch that threshold, fascinated by how life clung to the body even as it betrayed itself. Some victims struggled, some smiled faintly, trusting her to the end. "I wanted to see how much they could bear," she admitted. "It was beautiful." Her fascination grew so consuming that she began adjusting her doses not to kill immediately, but to shape the experience, lengthening the passage between life and death, like a composer drawing out a final note. Each vial, each syringe, became a symbol of dominion. Jane no longer saw herself as nurse or woman, but as arbiter, deciding who would rest, and when. Her poisons didn't just take lives, they rewrote her role in them. For the first time, she wasn't forgotten, she was unforgettable. Between 1895 and 1901, Jane Toppan's life blurred into a procession of deathbeds. Patients, employers, landlords, even friends, each one fell under her gentle orbit and never rose again. There was Mrs. Aldrich, who praised Jane's kindness in her final hours, Miss Gibbs, who invited her for tea and was found cold by morning, and poor Mary McLear, whose husband recalled Jane staying by her bedside like an angel. The pattern was invisible to everyone but her. Each death was a reunion, a quiet performance played to an audience of one. She grew bolder, confident in her methods, even playful. She sometimes slept beside the dying, cradling them as they slipped away. "I liked to feel their breath stop against my cheek," she confessed years later, as if describing an act of tenderness. Her victims never screamed. They trusted her, and that was the point. She spoke softly as she poisoned them, whispered comforts while the paralysis took hold, humming hymns to mask the rasping of breath. Death became not an interruption, but an art form, a sequence she could refine. When one mixture proved too fast, she adjusted it. When another caused distress, she noted it in her mind. The notebook returned, more precise, more confident. The final moments of her victims were catalogued like experiments. Yet she never saw herself as a killer. "I was giving them peace," she told the police. "They were mine, and I stayed until they were gone." The paradox of her persona, sweetness and savagery, baffled everyone who met her. In public, she laughed, told jokes, offered pastries to neighbors. In private, she measured doses by lamplight, murmuring to herself, "Just enough." By 1901, Jane Toppan was no longer merely a nurse. She was the most intimate executioner New England had ever known, her touch mistaken for mercy, her victims for sleep.
By the time the authorities began connecting her trail, Jane's legend had already outpaced suspicion. Death certificates read like a chorus of coincidence: cardiac arrest, gastritis, exhaustion. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no evidence of theft or malice. Every victim had died under care, not conflict. That made Detective John Rogers's job nearly impossible. He'd seen murderers who used guns, razors, fire, but never compassion. Her kindness was her weapon. He sat for nights studying her movements across the state, each town a note in a requiem. "If she did this," he wrote in his case log, "she did it between the lines." Poison was invisible, subtle, patient, everything a killer needed to hide behind the facade of virtue. Hospitals dismissed suspicions. Families praised her devotion. A grieving widower even donated to her church in thanks for her comfort in our darkest hours. But Rogers couldn't ignore the arithmetic. Too many deaths in too short a time, too many consistent details in unrelated households. The Boston toxicologists he consulted shook their heads. "Atropine and morphine together," one said. "Only a nurse could know how to balance those." That was the revelation. She wasn't defying medicine. She was using it perfectly. The case tormented him. He couldn't indict a smile. "Every man wants to believe the nurse beside his wife's bed means her well," he said. "She made monsters of our certainties." When he finally confronted her at her boarding room in Cambridge, she seemed amused by his restraint. "You think I'm evil?" she asked. "I think you're careful," he replied. She nodded, almost fondly. "That's why we understand each other." Rogers walked away that night shaken. For the first time in his career, he realized guilt didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it brewed tea, folded linens, and waited for him to find what he couldn't yet prove.
By the summer of 1901, the case of Jane Toppan had become a whisper across Massachusetts. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances when her name surfaced. Families who had once sought her nursing hands now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. Yet, paradoxically, many still defended her. How could someone so gentle, so attentive, be guilty of such monstrous deceit? That paradox defined the age. Trust was the social glue, and Jane had weaponized it. Detective Rogers stood before a town meeting in Barnstable that June, presenting the growing list of the dead, but each name landed like a rumor, not a fact. "You're saying," a farmer asked, "that a nurse, our Jane, did this?" Rogers hesitated before replying, "I'm saying she was the only one there when they stopped breathing." The crowd murmured but didn't move. They didn't want to believe that kindness could kill. Jane's laughter still echoed in their kitchens, her biscuits still sweet on their tongues. That's how she endured, protected by the very affection she forged. Even when suspicion bloomed, she visited the graves, laid flowers, and wept convincingly. The illusion of innocence was her final disguise. And if you're as stunned as the townsfolk who once trusted her hands, remember to subscribe to Glen. Every untold confession we uncover brings us closer to the shadows of history, where mercy and murder often wear the same smile. Her name, once a whisper of comfort, was about to become a synonym for dread. Within weeks, her final performance would begin, the deaths that even she couldn't conceal. For Rogers, it would no longer be a question of if she killed, but how many. The nurse who had nursed everyone else's grief was now the storm itself. And Massachusetts, The state that had once trusted her would soon learn that evil doesn't always knock, it's already inside. After the Davis family deaths, Jane might have slipped away again, vanished into another boarding house, another town willing to trust a smiling nurse. But obsession always draws its own borders. That summer, she set her sights on the Gibbons family of Bourne, Massachusetts. They were cousins of the late Myra Davis, respectable people, cautious, and initially reluctant to host her. Yet Jane arrived grieving, claiming she only wished to help them through their sorrow. Minnie Gibbons, young and tender-hearted, took pity. Within days, Jane was managing their household, preparing meals, adjusting their schedules, blending into their routines with that familiar, suffocating kindness. Minnie noticed how Jane's attention lingered too long, how her cheerfulness seemed rehearsed. Then the symptoms began again: faintness, stomach pain, dizziness. Jane diagnosed it as summer complaint, insisting on personally handling the remedies. Within a week, Minnie's husband was dead. Another week, Minnie followed. The physician blamed heat exhaustion, but Minnie's sister, sharp-eyed and unafraid, did not. She wrote to the family doctor in Catormit, the same man who had treated the Davises, asking if he'd noticed similar accidents. That letter would be Jane's undoing. When the doctor reviewed his old notes, the pattern revealed itself like an old wound reopening: sudden illness, morphine symptoms, the constant presence of Nurse Toppan. Authorities quietly exhumed 2 bodies. The results were undeniable: poison. Rogers was summoned. He'd expected her to flee, but Jane stayed, serene as ever, arranging flowers at Minnie's grave. When he approached her for questioning, she greeted him with her usual composure. "Detective," she said softly, "you look tired. Let me make you tea." He declined. "You've made enough tea for everyone in Massachusetts," he replied. For the first time, her smile faltered. The experiment was over. The observation had turned inward. Now she was the one being studied.
The bodies of Minnie Gibbons and her husband were laid out on the autopsy tables at Harvard Medical School under the watch of Dr. Charles Hill, a man unaccustomed to finding the extraordinary in domestic deaths. Yet what he found beneath the stillness of those corpses would alter the course of American forensic history. The stomach contents were faintly bitter, their odor suggestive but elusive. When he applied standard reagents, the solution darkened, slowly, unmistakably, revealing the chemical ghosts of morphine and atropine. 2 opposites, one to calm, one to stimulate, woven together in unnatural duet. Hill had seen morphine overdoses before, but never in combination. It wasn't accidental. It was orchestration, the signature of someone who understood physiology like a composer understands tension. He repeated the test twice to be certain, each time arriving at the same conclusion: these people had not died of natural causes. "The body spoke," he wrote in his report, "and its language was poison." When Rogers received Hill's findings, he felt both relief and dread. The evidence he'd hunted for years was finally tangible, proof that the soft-voiced nurse who charmed half the state had weaponized medicine with surgical precision. He ordered immediate exhumations of other suspected victims: the Davises, Elizabeth Toppan, even hospital patients long buried. One by one, the autopsies whispered the same refrain: traces of morphine, traces of atropine, doses that danced too close to the edge to be chance. The newspapers caught scent of it next. The Boston Globe printed the headline: "A nurse accused of murder by prescription." Panic rippled through the city's wards and homes. Families reread old letters from Dear Jane, hands trembling. Dr. Hill later testified that her mixture was as deliberate as it was delicate, calling it the work of a mind both intelligent and godless. For Rogers, the case had shifted from pursuit to reckoning. The question was no longer what Jane had done, but how she had done it for so long without anyone seeing her smile for what it truly was. When they came for her a second time, there was no pretense of confusion. Jane Toppan knew exactly what awaited her. The newspapers had already turned her into a macabre fascination, the smiling angel of death, the kind nurse with a killer's hand. By the morning of her arrest, the boarding house on Massachusetts Avenue was surrounded by a murmuring crowd. Housewives craned from windows,
Children whispered about the poison lady. Inside, Jane sat at her dressing table, brushing her hair as if preparing for a social call. Detective John Rogers entered with 2 uniformed men. She turned, eyes bright. "You took your time," she said lightly. "I wondered if I should go find you myself." Rogers read the warrant aloud. The charges were formal now, multiple counts of murder by poisoning, fraud, and malpractice. But Jane barely listened. She was studying his face, the way his voice trembled on the word murder. Her arrest was strangely domestic. She asked permission to collect her hat and gloves, thanked the landlady for her kindness, and even fed scraps to the boarding house cat before stepping into the carriage. The crowd outside pressed forward, murmuring prayers and curses. One reporter shouted, "Miss Toppan, did you do it?" She paused, looked directly at him, and smiled, a calm, measured smile that unsettled everyone. "I only gave them what they needed," she replied. At the station, she refused a solicitor. "I'll tell you everything," she promised Rogers. "But not yet. Let them wonder." Her composure confounded even the sheriff, who described her as neither proud nor repentant, merely curious. When the first night passed in her cell, she asked for a lamp and a book of Psalms. By dawn, she'd memorized a verse about mercy. When the matron asked why, Jane said, "Because no one believes mercy can hurt." Rogers recorded in his notes that she slept soundly. The next morning, she began to talk. When the questioning began, the detectives expected denial, tears, hysteria, pleas for misunderstanding. Instead, Jane Toppan leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and began to count. "I killed 33, she said simply, as if listing inventory. The room went silent. Rogers thought she was bluffing, but she started naming them, one by one, in chronological order, from her hospital years to her boarding house days. She spoke their names tenderly, recalling their symptoms, their final words, the precise mixtures she'd used. "I'd start with a whisper of morphine," she explained, "then a breath of atropine, just enough to make them open their eyes before the end. I wanted to see the soul in transit." Her tone was clinical, detached, more lecturer than lunatic. When asked why she wrote nothing of remorse in her diary, she frowned faintly. "Remorse? For what? I didn't hate them. I loved them. I only wanted to keep them." The confession filled over 40 pages of testimony. She described holding victims as they died, feeling their bodies stiffen, timing their final sighs. She even admitted to killing her foster sister, Elizabeth, and said it was her most satisfying work. "It felt right," she told the court stenographer. "She always thought she was better than me. In the end, she wasn't." When the statement was released to the press, Boston recoiled. Headlines screamed, "The nurse who slept beside her victims, and she killed for love, not for gain." The public struggled to categorize her. Women were supposed to nurture, men to kill. Jane blurred that boundary with a smile. Rogers, listening to her monologue, felt nauseated not by the crimes but by her serenity. "She spoke of death," he wrote, "as though she'd found its rhythm and merely wanted to share the tune." At the end of her confession, she looked at him and asked, "Will they remember me kindly?" He couldn't answer. The question wasn't madness, it was legacy.
The morning Jane Toppan's confession reached the newspapers, Boston awoke to collective disbelief. The woman who had soothed their sick, who'd walked their streets with a basket of remedies and laughter, was now branded the nurse from hell. The story spread like infection, headlines dripping with horror, sermons denouncing her as an instrument of the devil, scientists arguing over whether she was human at all. Women fainted reading the details. Men swore never to let a nurse near their homes again. The medical community reeled. Hospital boards convened emergency meetings, fearful of how trust itself had been poisoned. Every act of care now carried a shadow.
Jane, meanwhile, was the calm center of the storm. Behind bars, she seemed more composed than ever, reading the papers aloud, amused by her own notoriety. "They call me the nurse from hell," she said to Rogers one morning. "But wasn't I also the only one who stayed with them to the end?" Her tone wasn't defiant, It was wistful, almost wounded. "The doctors left when they couldn't help," she continued. "I stayed." She genuinely believed that made her merciful. Crowds gathered outside the jail each day, some to curse her name, others merely to see her. Reporters described her eyes as grey and watchful, like a cat in an empty room. Children chanted her name in the streets, half in fear, half in fascination. The nation's appetite for female monsters had found its perfect embodiment. Lectures were delivered about the dangers of women's education, about what happens when nurses play God. But beneath the moral panic lay something deeper, a societal unease that such evil could wear domestic gentility so convincingly. When one journalist asked Jane if she regretted her crimes, she smiled faintly. "I regret that they think I'm cruel," she said. "Cruelty is quick. I was patient." Rogers later wrote that this was the moment he realized she'd won in her own way. The world finally saw her completely, and that, to Jane Toppan, was all she'd ever wanted. The courtroom in Barnstable was packed beyond capacity on the morning Jane Toppan was scheduled to appear. Reporters jostled for position, their pens trembling over blank pages waiting for the drama of a lifetime. A woman accused of murdering 36 souls with tenderness as her weapon. But the trial the public demanded never truly began. The defense had only one strategy: insanity. Dr. Edward Cahill and a panel of physicians from Taunton and Worcester testified that Jane was morally perverted, emotionally arrested, and medically unsound. They described her as a woman incapable of distinguishing affection from annihilation. Yet those who heard her speak privately doubted that claim. Jane was far too lucid, too deliberate. When asked by the judge whether she understood the charges, she replied, "Perfectly. You believe I am insane because I enjoyed my work." The courtroom murmured, half horrified, half spellbound. Rogers sat in the gallery, his jaw tight. He'd wanted justice, not pity. Watching her, he realized that the law wasn't equipped to try someone like her, someone whose crimes were invisible, whose victims had died grateful. When the verdict came, not guilty by reason of insanity, the crowd erupted. Some gasped in outrage, others sighed in relief that such an abomination could not be called human. Jane remained unmoved. "Does that mean I stay?" she asked softly. The judge clarified, she would be committed for life to Taunton State Hospital, an asylum for the criminally insane. She smiled. "Then I will still have patience." The newspapers raged for weeks. "Justice denied," wrote one. "The smiling murderess escapes the gallows," cried another. But within a month, public fury cooled into fascination. Illustrations of her face, plain, matronly, unforgettable, filled pamphlets on criminal psychology. Rogers tore each clipping into pieces. To him, the insanity verdict was a convenience, not an answer. "She was sane," he wrote in his final report, "just beyond our comprehension." For Jane, confinement wasn't punishment, it was continuity. A new ward, new faces, and the same soft hymns echoing through the halls. Taunton State Hospital was a fortress of brick and silence, its long corridors echoing with the shuffle of slippered feet and the murmur of minds unmoored. When Jane Toppan arrived in 1902, the attendants braced for violence or breakdown. Instead, she stepped through the iron gates as though entering a new employer's home. "You'll find me useful here," she told the warden, smiling. Within days, she had memorized the routines, the meal hours, the nurses' names, the locations of every medicine key. Patients found her soothing. Staff found her efficient. She folded linens with care, tended to the catatonic, and corrected younger nurses with the authority of experience. It was as if the asylum had not confined her but simply redressed her role. "She behaves," one doctor wrote, "not as an inmate, but as staff." Rogers visited once during those early months. He expected the hollow stare of remorse, but found her cheerful, animated, even radiant. "They call me Miss Kelly here," she told him, reverting to her birth name with an air of rebirth. "I've begun again." When he asked whether she ever thought of her victims, she laughed lightly. "Oh, detective," she said, "you think they aren't here? They visit me every night." In Taunton's dim ward lights, she became something between nurse and ghost. Patients whispered that she stood by their beds at night, checking pulses, humming the same lullabies that had once accompanied death. Some said she called roll, naming those she'd killed as if conducting a séance. Her composure unsettled even the physicians. She exhibits no anxiety, one report noted. She appears to believe herself immortal. Jane wrote letters to newspapers, never mailed, insisting she had been misunderstood, that she had only sought to comfort. By 1905, her hair had silvered, but her posture remained impeccable. She told a young attendant, "I'm still useful. They just changed the uniforms." In the institution meant to cage her, she had found sanctuary. The hospital had become her final ward, her audience now perpetual, her reign unbroken.
Inside Taunton's echoing wards, Jane resumed her vocation as though nothing had changed. The nurses soon learned that she could not be idle. She polished bed frames, folded gowns, and gently corrected orderlies when they handled the patients roughly. "You must be kind," she would whisper, "so they don't notice when they fade." It was easy to forget she wasn't staff, until someone remembered why she was there. Every morning she requested to make rounds. Every evening she sat at her writing desk, noting the days, conditions. No one dared ask whose. The hospital administrators, uneasy but superstitious, allowed her small privileges: clean linens, a sewing kit, access to the infirmary garden, anything to keep her content. Contentment, with Jane, was safer than boredom.
To new inmates, she appeared maternal. She tucked blankets under their chins, recited psalms, and told stories about a time when she worked in great hospitals and was much loved. One patient later testified to seeing her sit beside a dying woman, stroking her hair and murmuring, "There, don't fight it now." The woman died moments later. The doctor marked the cause as exhaustion. No one investigated further. The institution preferred quiet to questions. Rogers returned only once more, years later, after a rumor spread that Jane had a ward of her own. He found her seated in the courtyard, mending a doll's dress for one of the inmates. "Still at work, Miss Toppan?" he asked. She looked up, smiling faintly. "Always. They need me." When he reminded her she was a patient, she tilted her head. "Detective," she said gently, "you've never understood. I was never one of them. I only stayed so they wouldn't be alone." Her delusion, or faith, endured for decades. Even as her hands trembled with age, she insisted on taking pulses, adjusting pillows, whispering lullabies to the air. Staff began calling her Mother Jane, half mockingly, half in fear. By then, the distinction between nurse and murderer had vanished entirely. She had become what she always wanted to be: indispensable at the bedside, the last face before silence. Years passed, and the world moved on. New crimes filled the headlines, new faces replaced the old terrors. But for Detective John Rogers, the memory of Jane Toppan lingered like a wound that refused to close. He kept her file in the bottom drawer of his desk, sealed with twine, yet some nights he would untie it, read her words, and hear her voice again, calm, reasoning, patient. Her confession had been too articulate to dismiss as madness. She had understood everything she'd done, down to the last breath of her victims. "She killed as though she were curing," he once said, "and that makes her the most dangerous of all." When he retired, he returned to Taunton one last time, compelled by unfinished business. The matron led him to her cell, an airy corner room filled with wilted flowers and folded linens. Jane sat by the window, thin and grey, humming to herself. For a moment, he thought she hadn't aged at all, only diminished, distilled into pure composure. "Do you remember me?" he asked. She looked up and smiled. "Of course," she said. "You were the one who wanted proof." Her tone was gentle, forgiving almost. "Did you ever find what you were looking for?" He didn't answer. She nodded, as though he had confirmed her suspicion. "I thought not," she said. "Because you keep asking the wrong question." He leaned forward. "And what's the right one?" Jane turned her gaze back to the courtyard, where patients shuffled in the light. "Not why I killed," she said softly, "but why it was so easy." That night, Rogers burned the last of her letters, but her words stayed. He wrote in his diary before closing it forever, "She forced us to see that evil doesn't always hate. Sometimes, it admires. Sometimes, it believes it's helping." He died 3 years later, his notes sealed beside her photograph. The nurse's eyes in the image still seemed alive, steady, studying him. Perhaps she was right. Some truths don't die, they only wait to be revisited. Jane Toppan's name lingered long after her body was confined. She became a cautionary echo in America's conscience, a reminder that evil no longer wore a villain's mask, but a nurse's cap. The newspapers that once sensationalized her case began to print editorials asking harder questions. What allowed this woman to thrive? Who watched and did nothing? Her crimes shook the pillars of trust in medicine, in womanhood, in decency itself. For decades, female nurses had been symbols of virtue, Florence Nightingale's successors, the gentle saviors of the sick. Jane inverted that mythology completely. "The hand that heals may also hush," one preacher warned, his congregation silent with unease. Hospitals tightened their regulations, tracking every vial and dosage, instituting policies that would become the foundations of modern nursing ethics. But still, her story haunted the wards. Nurses whispered about her in break rooms, doctors cited her during lectures. "Never trust familiarity," one would say. It was familiarity that killed them. For ordinary Americans, her legend grew monstrous. Penny pamphlets and pulp novels transformed her into folklore, a woman who killed with a kiss, a demon in white. But beneath the sensationalism, the horror was uncomfortably human. She had not killed for money or survival, but for closeness, for belonging. That motive struck a chord deeper than greed. It spoke to loneliness, to the hunger for control when one has none. By 1910, Jane's case was being studied in medical schools alongside the likes of H. Holmes and Lizzie Borden. Yet unlike them, her weapon wasn't spectacle, it was subtlety. She hadn't built murder castles or wielded axes. She'd offered comfort, and people had accepted it willingly. The idea that a smile could suffocate was new, and it terrified a nation built on civility. One psychologist wrote, "If Jane Toppan had been born a man, she might have been a surgeon, applauded for precision. But as a woman, her precision became pathology." America wanted to forget her, but couldn't. She had forced it to see that the face of evil might not glare, it might tuck you in, whisper that you're safe, and mean it.
Across Massachusetts, the ground still holds her victims, though few know their names. Their graves are scattered, from Cambridge to Cataumet, from Boston's crowded plots to rural churchyards where moss has erased the letters. Most were buried quietly, their deaths recorded as natural causes. No markers, no epitaphs, no families left to tend them. The state archives list them in neat columns, age, sex, date of death, but the true story of their passing is trapped beneath the soil, sealed by trust betrayed. Detective Rogers once tried to visit a few of the burial sites, but the headstones were gone, reclaimed by weather or neglect. "They never had justice," he wrote. "Only her memory."
At Taunton, Jane sometimes spoke their names aloud at night, as if reciting roll call. An attendant reported hearing her whisper to the empty hallway, "All present." Perhaps she believed they were still with her, those she had held, lulled, and taken. In her mind, none had ever truly left. The few families who survived the scandal rarely spoke of it again. The Davises' distant relatives changed their surname, the Gibbs kin refused interviews, even hospital staff who'd worked beside Jane denied ever knowing her. The silence became its own monument. History moved on, but the victim's absence remained, an invisible ledger of lives dissolved by the one person they trusted most. Every so often, a gravedigger or archivist uncovers an old record, death attended by J. Toppan, nurse, and pauses, realizing what those initials mean. But the moment passes. The file is reshelved, the dirt replaced. The world remembers killers who brandished violence, not those who offered comfort. Yet under the soil, the truth breathes faintly. Each unmarked grave is a page torn from her diary, rewritten by time, waiting for the reader who dares to look closely enough to see her signature at the bottom. History would remember Jane Toppan as a monster, but monsters, as the narrator of her story must confess, are rarely born in isolation. She was a creation of a system that confused obedience for goodness, that rewarded silence more than scrutiny. In late 19th century America, a nurse's word was sacred, a woman's gentleness beyond question. Hospitals were overcrowded, supervision lax, and the boundaries between medicine and experiment porous. Jane simply stepped into the space the system had left unguarded and filled it with her own interpretation of care. She didn't invent cruelty, she institutionalized it through kindness. Medical records from her years of practice reveal no oversight, no second opinions, no checks on her prescriptions. Deaths were expected, not examined. To the men who ran those wards, the value of a good nurse lay in her quietness. She never complained, one superintendent said admiringly during the inquiry. They meant it as praise. It should have been an indictment. Every unchecked dose, every unreviewed report, every unasked question became another accomplice. The tragedy of Jane Toppan isn't merely what she did, it's how easily she was allowed to do it. The system had built her a stage, taught her the choreography, applauded her devotion, and then recoiled when she performed too well. In that light, she was both villain and mirror, reflecting the complacency of those who believed virtue was visible. Rogers once said in a private note, "She was the product of our blindness." And perhaps he was right. The more her story spread, the more it became an indictment not of one woman's madness but of a culture that refused to see beneath politeness. Jane's legacy endured not because she defied her world, but because she revealed it, its hierarchy, its trust, its refusal to imagine that the gentlest hand could also be the deadliest. In the end, it was never just Jane Toppan who killed. It was the quiet faith of a nation that never thought to ask what mercy costs. In 1938, an orderly at Taunton State Hospital found Jane Toppan sitting by her window, motionless, her head tilted toward the light as though listening to a distant lullaby. She had been dead for hours. Her expression, they said, was peaceful, serene even. But to those who knew her story, that faint upward curl of her lips carried a chill that lingered long after her body was taken away. The newspapers barely noticed her passing. A single paragraph in the Boston Herald marked her death. Jane Toppan, known as Jolly Jane, died at Taunton Asylum, age 84. No mention of the 33. No mention of the lives she ended with tenderness mistaken for grace. The world, perhaps mercifully, had moved on. Her body was buried in a numbered grave among others the world had forgotten. No visitors came, no flowers laid. Yet her story persisted, whispered in nursing schools, dissected in criminology classes, invoked by journalists whenever kindness turned cruel. The image of her smile, half maternal, half predatory, became the symbol of a truth most prefer not to face, that evil need not shout, nor strike, nor rage. It can hum lullabies. It can pour tea. It can comfort while it kills. If one walks the grounds of Taunton today, the red brick buildings crumble, vines swallowing the windows, wind carrying echoes down the empty halls. And in that stillness, you can almost imagine her voice, soft, coaxing, instructive, "Don't be afraid. It's only rest." Perhaps she meant it. Perhaps, in her mind, every death was a kindness misunderstood. Jane Toppan never left descendants, but her legacy lives in the unspoken question she left behind. How well do you know the hands that promised to save you? Because sometimes, the smile that stays the longest isn't the one that comforted you, it's the one that watched you stop breathing.